And now let's talk about Symbian kernel in more details. The Symbian kernel is a nano kernel. The core services that are generally part of the operating system. The reason why the kernel keeps to minimum or nano is to conserving the battery sources, and because of the nature of the phone that is always on. So that's why it chooses the nano kernel. Some of the other uh, operating system like Windows, they have the microkernel, but for this one, they use nano. At least they want the kernel small as possible. The kernel of the Symbian OS is what they called as AKA, or stand for Epoch Architecture. As I mentioned in the first slide, that the original uh, operating system wherein the Symbian is derived is from the Epoch. So that's why their kernel is they name it after the original operating system Epoch. So they have two kind of Symbian kernel, the AKA1 and the AKA2. So the main difference between AKA1 and AKA2 is that AKA2 has the ability to have a full telephone signal in stock, meaning it has a support for more advanced telco standard like EDGE and GPRS. Both AKE1 and AKE2 are run on the ARM CPU. I'm gonna talk about CPU later. But the important difference between AKE1 and AKE2 is the ability of AKE2 to run in a Wins emulator, which run as a single Windows process. This is very important, particularly to the developer of third-party application for Symbian, because they can now simulate uh, Symbian operating system on top of the Windows OS. Uh, this is important to the developer so that after they finish the third-party apps, they can actually test it right away because they have operating system, Symbian operating system on the OS machine. So that's why they create the AK2 kernel. Uh, Both kernel handle the primary tasks of CPU process scheduler and memory management and other device driver. The One of the important job of the Symbian kernel is to allow dynamic memory allocation of management physical resources, page memory, and cache because of a limitation of size. 'Cause, as I mentioned earlier, because we have an embedded system, so at during the time the memory in the smartphone are not so large. So one of the job of the uh, kernel is to allocate instruction between the memory. And also, Symbian kernel is a priority-based single task uh, kernel. It's only allocate CPU time based on single task trading priority. Kernel switches CPU times between multiple threads, giving the user of the mobile phone the impression that multiple applications are running at the same time. The Symbian kernel also supports path as internal file system for the compatibility with the removing device or secondary device like flash drive or flash memory. And now let's talk about how this kernel uh, able to talk to RAM and CPU of the phone. Let's start with the RAM.